Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Ryan, also known as Reziel, and it is my pleasure to bring to you all a video series detailing building and painting the Contemptor Achillus Dreadnought from Forgeworld for the Adeptus Custodes. This is a fan favorite model kit. It is still going to be available to play in Warhammer 40,000 for 10th edition, also Horus Heresy, and I'm really looking forward to showing it off to you guys. Round 1 is specifically building. Round 2 will be painting. I'm going to try to get these condensed so that you just have to take a look at the most important points of the process, and I'll give you commentary over top. Let's not drag it out, let's get right into it. Alright, so starting off, we've got our basic packaging here. This is pretty common for Forgeworld kits. They do generally very basic packaging, white boxes or plain bags, things like that. Inside those, there's going to be a plastic, like clamshell blister, oftentimes different sizes and shapes depending on the kit, and a lot of times it's just going to have like the bulk resin parts, and then of course your instruction manual. The bulk resin parts are usually just kind of in there, and you get your base and things, and then your instruction manual is color, often, not always, but often, and you get like pictures of your main model, usually painted, and you'll get your part list. You'll get some form of instructions on how to put the kits together. They're generally a lot simpler, a lot simpler than the GW kits, the plastic kits, and sometimes they're helpful and sometimes not. This basically is just how your parts are going to show up on these resin blocks. They're going to be attached basically, you know, the way that they were molded and different things, and I just like to go through and check them, each one, to see if anything's broken, if there's any missing, if there is any details that I need to remember for cleanup, such as like this mold drift here where there's a line there running up and down the leg. That's something to clean. And I like to check main parts like the torso really carefully. There can often be miscasting, bubbles, other things, you know, just problems in there. This one turned out really well, so I was pretty happy with that. It's always worth it to check. And also stuff like these pauldrons, that is another very good part to check. Those are like high visibility parts, and they have some molded detail on there that you really want to come out looking great, so those are some of the main ones. These hands were unique too for me for a Forgeworld kit. I hadn't come across something like that before, and but they are very similar to Bandai kits. I wonder if somebody at Forgeworld has been making Gundams and maybe got some inspiration from there. So those are pretty interesting. The main attraction of this kit is arguably the Dread Spear, though. This particular weapon is very cool. It looks great, and it's cast all in one piece, which, you know, has its good points and bad points. One of the things specifically about this one was it had a lot of mold release on there. I guess I'd rather have more mold release than any issues from it coming out of the mold. And just like a lot of parts that might be similar in size or length or weight, this one has some curve in it, and we'll take a look at how to get curving and warping out of these parts. It's not as bad as you might think. So lastly, I like to check out my instructions for the part list, make sure that everything's matching up, and get an idea of kind of where I'm headed with the model. And then I want to use the picture here to help with the pose for this model. I don't want to do exactly this pose because I've already done a model for the owner in a similar pose, and I want to make sure also that the weapon isn't sticking way out for any line of sight issues during gameplay, because that could be a thing. Now here I'm using some old Remora footage, this is not from the Dreadnought, to show how I clip these parts out. They're very simple. You do it very similarly from how you cut other model kits, and I'm just removing these pegs to get easier access to those other parts. You know, you just cut a little bit away from your part, not right up against it. That way you're not cutting anything you don't need to. You can always go back and clean off more, but you will have a lot harder time putting extra bits that you may have cut off back. So it is a good idea to just use your, I guess, best practices, quote unquote, for when you're cutting parts off of sprues very similarly, and the resin works a little differently to the plastic, but you'll get a feel for it if you're using these. So I want to use this leg part, the bottom section of the leg, the lower leg, to sort of do a comparison and kind of just go through all of the techniques that I do for cleaning up parts that I've cut off the sprue. And that way we don't have to go through every part on the kit. There will be a little bit of crossover, but we'll just take a look here on the leg. And I'll primarily do something like use the hobby knife to do a ton of the work. I will go through, and right here I'm going to be slicing off flash from the molds along this curve, and this is super easy to cut through. I sort of have my own cutting technique, as you can see, like how I hold the knife. Some others of you might be similar, and some others might be different. It's all up to you what you're comfortable with. This is what I am. It's very safe for me, but definitely use caution with your knives, especially cutting towards you. And then you'll see here there's 3 connection points on this leg, and those are very important points to check, because those were where that was connected to the brick that it's attached by the sprue there. And so you'll have to make sure you do a good job cleaning those up. And like there's a peg in the middle here that I'm not going to be able to use the knife on. So what I do is I break out the actually my God hand nippers, because they're a lot sharper. This resin especially, it's not too tough. It's pretty easy to cut through, and so it shouldn't give any problem for these God hands. And these God hands are just going to help me get rid of the heavier bulk of that nub from the block, and then the knife will be able to go back and handle the rest. Basically, over time, you'll just be able to go through, clean things up, carve it out, and shape this guy into what you need it to be. And I'll generally try to match the 2 pieces, and towards the end, I'll actually put them together and get a side-by-side. We're going to also uncover some extra things that we have to work on, such as bubbles and that, and that's a common thing with resin, but it's actually way easier than a lot of people would think to mess with, especially on a kit like this. It's not like we're working with like a tiny mini, like an infantry model, and there's like a bubble in his face or something. So this is going to be pretty easy. We'll take a look at it. Now, one of the things that I will do on a lot of these parts, because of the way resin casts work, and one of the reasons they have been so popular for such a long time, is they carry a lot of detail. They can end up with really sharp edges, not dangerously so, but it will make it a little bit weird for painting. So what I do like to do is go through and just clean off some of the extra sharp edges on a lot of the big surfaces and things, because if I want to do edge highlighting or something like that, anywhere on the model, those really sharp edges are not going to necessarily do the best job showing the paint. So that's one thing I'll go through and get rid of any high rough spots that are appropriate, and uniform the edges out. And then, as always, the trusty hobby toothbrush. Highly recommend, if you don't already have a toothbrush in your hobby kit, please get one. It really helps. Then I'm going to go in with the sanding stick. So the sanding stick is going to help me in this case because it's a nice flat rigid surface. I know what grits that I have really quick to hand, mostly 400 in this case, but I'm just going to use this. I use it on a lot of parts of the model, but this really showcases it pretty well too, because I've got some flat surfaces. I've got some mostly flat surfaces that have a little bit of curve that the sanding stick works on as well. And then for anything else, I can either use a file or some loose sandpaper later. And one of the areas that's going to be really good for the sanding stick here is those bottom edges where it was originally connected to the block. And that's going to do a really, really good job of cleaning that off. And I just can't recommend that enough. That and the hobby toothbrush. Of course, don't brush your teeth with it. I wouldn't recommend that. Definitely not. And so finally, I mean, basically putting those two together, they're at the same stage and ready to move on and take a look at cleaning up and fixing these air bubbles. So these were not the most visible ones potentially that you might run across, but it's worth fixing them. And so right now I'm using gel super glue. I probably prefer liquid, but this is what I have at the moment. And I have that accelerator bottle, which just helps it dry faster. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a little bit of the glue. I'm going to force it into the air bubble hole. Just get it in there, in all the air bubbles that I can reach. And then that's going to seal that hole up. And then once I get that accelerator on there, it's going to pretty much dry instantly, or it'll harden instantly. The accelerator dries really quickly. It dries a lot faster than water, but you can dry it with a towel. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take some sandpaper and or my file. In fact, I'm going to start off with my file. This one happens to have a rounded surface, which is going to help for this particular part. I'm just going to go in there and smooth off any of the glue that is sticking out proud of the flat piece there for that part. And I was able to do quite a bit with the file there, but I decided that the sandpaper would also be beneficial, so went back in with that. After some cleanup, you can still see where the holes are because the super glue is translucent, but the holes are filled. Now you can see there's not a crazy warp in the Dread Spear, but there is a nice consistent S-curve and a little bit on the blade. So I'm going to get one of the hobby secret weapons, the cheap hairdryer. The cheap hairdryer is a must-have, and I'm going to use it. You'd use it for a bunch of things, but one of the things is fixing resin like this. I'm just going to use it on low power. There's not a heat setting, and it's going to slowly build heat into the resin, and that's going to allow it to become pliable again. And when I take the heat off, I'll have some working time with it where it's very bendable. If you apply too much heat, it's going to lose detail and it's going to get really, really floppy. So I just watch it carefully, and then I'm very gentle with it. As I work it here, it's going to get into the shape that I want it to be in, as far as like being straight and whatnot. And I'll just go back periodically and check it. Sometimes you have to add a little bit more heat. Sometimes you have to cool it down. And I'm just basically going back and forth on the piece here on all the areas that need to be straightened. Mostly working on the tip of the blade there and making sure that anywhere I want to get some heat in there and start maneuvering the part, that is going to come out super laser straight. Now I don't know if this is actually super laser straight, but it is incredibly straighter than it was. So I think I'm pretty happy with how that came out. So you've got all your parts out, you've got them cleaned. You have to clean them again though, because they're covered in that mold release. And so I have like a sandwich meat tub that I've drilled holes in, and I just take it to the sink and I put it in some water, and I make sure to rinse it all off nice and well. It won't, the way I've done it, I've drilled all holes all through the bottom, so very small ones. The water won't stay in there forever. And I've just added dish soap, just basic dish soap. And I've gotten them in there and I'm gently stirring them around and getting them sudsy. And then I've cleaned them off. I think I've used just a basic other toothbrush type of deal, and then I let them dry, dried them with a towel, and let them set out and dry. And once they're perfectly dry, they're ready to go. So basically looking at this kit, it has holes for magnetization on the forearm, and it has a lot of forearm gun options. So I thought immediately, well, this is going to be easy. I mean, those holes are already in there, so I might as well find the diameter and then get the magnets. And in this case, they are 2 different depths. So I'm going to take a 2mm by 3mm and a 3mm by 1mm. So the thickness is 1mm and 2mm, and the widths are 3mm diameter disc magnets. And then I've got that 1/8 Dremel bit, and the hole's already almost big enough, so I'm just literally just making it a tiny bit wider. I'm just shaving it real quick. I'm not even putting the bit into a pin vise or anything. It's just taking a tiny bit off the extra, because that drill bit is basically the diameter of the magnet. And it's taking the tiniest bit out of there, but it's gonna allow me to get that magnet in there nice and tight. I'm just gonna check my polarity, because I've already done one test magnet. And then I'm going to get, again, I'm going to use the gel super glue. I'd probably still rather use liquid. I just didn't have any on hand, but gel is fine. And then I'm going to use that accelerator once I've got my magnet seated in. All you got to do with these is just make sure you've always got your polarities correct. However you need to check it. A lot of times I just check it by stacking the magnets together. Once that dries on there, especially with that accelerator, it's going to dry really quickly. You got your magnetization, you are pretty much ready to go and get them all swapped. So off camera, I've moved ahead again, basically building up a nice simple base using some cork, and I've also started putting together the parts. Now I have done a lot of dry fitting to get the legs into the shape that they're in, and all you really have to do is use super glue. I haven't done any pinning except for this toe. And I put a brass rod in this toe and I drilled a hole in the base there after kind of test fitting the legs and where they would go. And so the brass rod is up in the foot, drilled a nice like space for it, made sure not to poke through, and got that super glued in. And then I'm able to put that in and then place the model down and get the feet flat. And the thing I'm doing here is orienting the center of the body, basically that right in the middle of the spinal column, kind of the center of the torso of the model. You want to orient that as central to the center of the base as possible in many cases on many models, because that's how you're going to get the best positioning out of your model on that base. Now I'm going to use the torso here to kind of show the dry fit and super glue process on some of these bigger parts. And this one's kind of a good one to do that with, because you have the torso in 2 sections, and then you have it's got a bit of play in it, so you kind of have to figure out where it's going to go. And the head rests in there at the top of the torso underneath this cowling piece that's on top, and that cowling piece is another separate piece, and it affects how the vents on the back rest and kind of like where they touch, because they're going to glue both to the back and then also to the underside of that cowling piece. And you'll see later I leave that cowling piece separate. All I'm doing here is gluing the vents on, but I'm just making sure with the dry fit that I know how it's going to go together, because that's really good information. Dry fitting on these is a big deal. It's a big deal in modeling generally, but it's a really big deal on these. And so again, just going to go in with the super glue. You have to use super glue on these. There's really no better alternative that I'm aware of. And I'm putting it on the parts where the top piece that I'm using here is not going to touch, and I'm putting that on first. It's not getting any glue on it, and then I'm using that to put the vent piece in the tightest orientation I can for where it's going to sit later. So that way, as I've got the pieces under pressure there, it'll go together. That one's glued on after I've applied the accelerator, and I basically get to continue on from the work, and later I'll put that cowling piece on and it'll be just fine. And I just wanted to show here the arms real quick. Not really going into any detail on them. They did have a spot there between the upper arm and the lower arm that you could set a magnet. So if you wanted to magnetize that, you could. I did not do that in this case. I don't think that's necessary. I just did super glue and accelerator, and away we go. And also wanted to show one of the hands here, especially the one holding the spear, because they're kind of unique. So I had pulled off and cleaned the hands, definitely cleaned around the fingers and all of that, and I decided on how I was going to have him hold the spear, so I did a bunch of dry fitting on that as well, and planning. And basically you take the primary part of the hand, which is the thumb and the back of the hand and everything, and you get that on. I could basically glue that onto the spear. And then you take the finger parts that match for the gripping hand, and make sure you get some glue on that, and then you add those on top. And so it is, again, this is very similar to how some Gunpla kits go. But yeah, I basically attached the hand onto the spear and put the accelerator on there, and it got it nice and sturdy right off the bat, and that seemed to be the best way to go in this case, especially with the pose I chose. So at this stage, I've basically got a bunch of the stuff done. I've got an arm on, I've got the model glued down, and I'm going to use that Vallejo texture paste. This stuff is amazing. I'm going to use this spatula tool that I have, and you can use any spatula tool. And basically this is like diorama paste. Like if you use Games Workshop stuff, it's like the mud paste or theirs. But the thing is with this Vallejo stuff, I think it's like, it used to be 10 bucks, it might be 11 or 12 bucks now or something like that for that giant tub. And you can do whole armies with this stuff, and it has no color in it. You have to paint it, but the value is so much better than the Games Workshop stuff. I mean, the only thing I'm not aware that they have is like crackle. Like you can't do mud crackle, but that's not a big deal. There's other ways to do that. And here I'm just showing that you just continue to go around the base, and I'm using the small end of mine to get closer on some of the, up to the parts for detail on that. And I generally use a paper towel and stuff to wipe off the parts. And then here, after I've got it done, you can accelerate the drying time with this stuff, again, with the hairdryer. I just don't want to overheat the resin, but in this case, most of those resin parts are really, really heavy, so not that big a deal. And I think within 15 minutes, that stuff's totally dry. Now, this was part of the posing, and so I was using the spear and the arm and the body to kind of do a dry fit process so that I could set that spear. And basically, I wanted to get that arm in there, and I'm just adding glue around spots that I think it's going to contact the socket for the arm. And I'm not gluing the hand in, but I'm using it with the spear to get that arm in the right position. And as soon as I've got it kind of where I like it, I've got a little bit of time with that super glue. It's not instant drying, which is actually why I use Accelerator. But now that it's holding on there, I'm going to use one of my metal tools. There's a little bit too much glue, and I clean that off really quickly while it's still wet. And that works just fine. And then I go in and add the Accelerator in the gap there. That's going to get it to harden immediately, and then I'll get the maximum control, and it'll stick that pose that I really need. So we're able to get the spear in there just fine. It's in the pose we want, and we'll leave it separate, but it's looking exactly like I wanted. So we have all the parts laid out, we've got them clean, we've got them ready, and we're going to get them mounted for paint. And I like to use bamboo skewers and blue tack for a lot of small parts. You can see I got them all arrayed out there. I don't even have anything attached to the spear because I'll be able to do that just by holding it, and then even stuff like that big piece there, and individual hands and stuff. You know, there's many ways to subassembly, but the subassembly is what's going to go for the paint. And then I do have a big chonky paint handle for stuff like Dreadnoughts and big characters made out of a couple of lids, jar lids with tape. And that is the building. That is the full process. We are at the end of round 1 versus the Achillus Contemptor. And I've had a lot of fun building it. Stay tuned for round 2, where we move on to the painting process. Should be a little bit of a more in-depth video. Round 2 could go into overtime for round 3, but until then, bye for now.